The Philosophic Worldview by Michelle Sire, Catherine O'Donnell, Rye Schwartz, and Tara Beringer. What is the philosophical worldview? The philosophic mind is not content with disorder and changing appearances. Philosophy is a technique that begins in discontent, skepticism, and the inconsistencies of common experience to achieve an intellectual grasp of a single truth. The philosophical mind desires to have one answer to every question. They search for the answer, but sometimes find inconsistencies due to the different interpretations of forms among individuals. Those within the philosophical worldview don't like this inconsistency and try to combine the information into one single universal truth or answer. The philosophic mind becomes discontent when this cannot be achieved. They are driven to find the exact answer and won't settle for multiple interpretations. Once they find one answer to a question, they continue asking questions about their first answer to create a perfect, in-depth answer. In order to enter the philosophic mind, a person must begin to not accept what is presented before them. They become doubtful of the answer they have already been given. The philosophic mind must question an object or action before it enters the philosophical mind in order to make our own truth or belief about it. A big example of this is the belief that God created the world. Some people have chosen to question how he did it or why, while others merely accept the fact that he did. The philosophic mind must ask the question, why?
A second characteristic of the philosophical mind, then, is that it is abstract. Abstractions are non-sensual. Abstractions are grasped by the power of the mind rather than the power of the senses. When you hear the word abstract, what do you think of? Do you associate the word abstract with a piece of art? What exactly makes a painting abstract? What makes the philosophical mind abstract? Much like paintings, the philosophical mind can be described as abstract because the philosophical mind relies solely on the mind of the individual. Furthermore, the philosophical mind is non-sensual, or in other words, does not rely on the senses. Think about the thoughts and ideas that come to mind when we're looking at the abstract painting. Did you have the same interpretation as the person next to you? The answer is probably no. This is a great representation of the philosophical mind. These thoughts and ideas are created within the mind, without having to touch, taste, or smell the piece of art. Another example, Ford's 2 plus 2 equals 5, also deals with the idea of abstraction. Usually 2 plus 2 equals 4, but for this example we must deny this piece of information that has been demonstrated in front of our eyes and look into our mind to rationalize this expression that 2 plus 2 equals 5.
The Platonic mind locates meaning by finding connections to timeless abstract concepts, forms, and ideals. Platonic form, that is, the unifying abstractions grasped by the intellect, are timeless, universal, and changeless. In other words, as opposed to the materialistic world, there exist the Platonic forms. These forms are apart from the real-world objects. They are perfect, unchanging, ageless, and constant. We cannot grasp them in the real materialistic world, but can imagine them in our minds. A form is categorization or characteristic that unites extremely different objects under one description. Let's say you have 3 cats, one with stripes, one with dots, and one with plain black fur. All of these cats are ordinary objects that can see in the real world. All of these cats fit under one form. This form represents the perfect cat. This is why everybody would imagine when they think of a cat. Another example would be the form of ugliness. One person might see trash as ugly, while another might see pollution as ugly. Both of these objects fit under the form of ugliness because they embody it. We cannot see the perfect example of ugliness, for it does not exist in the real world. It is located inside of an object, hidden behind the materialistic form we cannot see and touch. 2 radically different objects could be categorized under the same form are fish, spiders, and other types of animal. Depending on the person's personal choices, all of these animals and insects could be categorized under the form of cuteness. The philosophical worldview says to look behind the appearance of an object and find the meaning of the object on the inside. This goes along with the trite saying, "Don't judge a book by its cover." These perfect forms are imagined in our minds, but do not exist in the real world. For example, the media might present us with the perfect body should look like, but that perfection does not exist anywhere because everybody has their own faults.
And then, sounding very much like a contemporary relativist, he goes on to say that every age, every condition of life, young and old, male and female, bound or free, has a different virtue, for virtue is relative to the actions and ages of each of us in all that we do. Because my context is always transistory, and specific, whereas forms are not, our connection to the philosophic mind is always tenuous and susceptible to being broken. The soul emerges in the philosophic mind when the questions that were asked of virtue and beauty are asked about me, when I too become an object of self-conscious reflection. Forms can exist anywhere, and there are lots of them. Radically different objects can fit under a form depending on how the mind thinks. Since materialistic objects can be categorized under so many different forms that we couldn't normally see as relating to each other, it is hard to grasp this concept since we desire to categorize each under our one characteristic. Our minds want everything we see to be separated and sorted, not all put under different forms. How we grew up and who we are as people also affect our ability to stay in the philosophic worldview. How we determine who we are depends upon characteristics such as gender, race, age, etc. For example, a person who is young might categorize reading under a form such as boring, while an older person who grew up in times where reading served as a form of leisure or enjoyment would not categorize under this form. They might instead categorize under a form such as worthwhile. With the open-mindedness to realize that reading could be categorized under each, we leave the philosophic worldview. The examples that Ford mentions are for the forms of virtue and beauty. What we categorize under each is relative to the way we think as individuals. When we contemplate what we think of as beauty, we too become a form of the perfect soul. Here, the good of the army, the status of Agamemnon, and the justice of his demand are cast in a language which presumes some general standard of good and propriety and of justice, by which the particular good and the particular propriety of the present situation can be estimated. The standards have to be expressed in ideal laws which just are. In a sense, the forms of the philosophical mind are ambiguous. Words such as good, justice, revenge, evil, bad, and on, can have radically different meanings to different people. This is seen in the Platonic forms' ability to relate different objects together that we normally wouldn't as individuals on a regular day-to-day basis. What determines if something is good? It all depends on the person. For example, one person might see sushi as good, while another might find it disgusting. As humans, we have a tendency to associate words with a general meaning. These terms are thus ambiguous because they can have different meanings to different people. In the material world of particulars, nothing is permanent or timeless or universal. In contrast, the essence of virtue is the same regardless of circumstance. Beauty exists whether it is found in a sunset or a building, whether it has occurred in ancient Greece or yesterday. The beautiful flower may pass away, but the form of beauty remains. We live in evil times, but virtue remains, even if we cannot find it or have never experienced it in our own lives. As mentioned on the other slide, in the real world nothing is permanent. Everything eventually dies or disappears. However, the forms do not. They are always there because there are always new items to categorize under them. For example, let's say the world is barren with nothing in it except for a man and a woman. These people are categorized under the form of intelligence. They eventually die, but before they do, they have a child. Even after they both die, the form they embodied does not disappear because their child is there to represent it.
The philosophical mind sacrifices illusion and the seduction of appearances, the flashing bright particulars, to know and conform to an abstract, non-sensual truth. The philosophical mind knows through dialect and conceptual thinking. The philosophical mind deliberately disengages from and objectifies knowledge. The philosophical mind looks at what's behind the appearance. The philosophical worldview doesn't act in the five senses. It acts on knowledge and intelligence. This means that they use forms and knowledgeable ideals to understand the information in the natural world. For example, a woman may be beautiful on the outside but have a bad personality on the inside. You must look past her looks to find out who she truly is. This is accomplished through the knowledge of the mind. We must separate ourselves from whatever it is we are judging to make a good decision. For example, when we break out of the mythic worldview, we separate ourselves from the story we are following in order to make a decision about whether or not to continue to follow the story or not. Once we reflect on the story or myth, we are in a philosophical mindset. In the philosophical worldview, the mind is what we use to make judgments. We let ourselves act only on the knowledge and information we have conceptually. This allows us to let ourselves detach from the five senses and to think critically about what is going on around us and how to react to it.
Next, we will go on to compare the mythic worldview to the philosophical worldview.
External, the outside world and senses, versus internal, relies on knowledge and insight of the mind. People live within the mythic worldview and never question their actions, thoughts, or storyline that they are living within. They rely mainly on their senses to explain things around them. For the philosophical worldview, it relies more on the mind and thinking about why you are choosing to take that specific course of action. For example, let's say there is a cookie right in front of you. You want to say this cookie is good, if you're in the mythical worldview. But the philosophical mind will take it further. Why does it look good? Is it because it is round? Is it because of what's in the cookie? Why does the cookie taste good to you? Is it sweet or spicy? What flavors are in the cookie that makes you say that it is good? These are the types of questions a philosophical mind would ask.
Character reliant versus reliant on the person, race, gender, status, experiences, age, etc. The person in a mythic worldview will act depending on the story or myth they are prescribed, and not on what they think or know. They are caught in the story or myth unless another story or myth comes along to replace that story or myth. A person in the philosophical worldview, however, will act upon their sense of knowledge and thinking instead of their five natural senses, and act with what they seem is right. For example, let's say there are two people who are the same age, one born into lower society and one born into higher society. They both are put into a situation where they meet a homeless person. It is more likely that the poor person will sympathize with the man and attempt to assist him, while the rich person will say something like, "Tough luck," and will keep them and their riches to themselves. This is just one example of what might happen. It could go the other way, with the lower class person feeling as though they can't spare anything and the rich person will help the man, or neither will help, or both will assist him. Based on who they are as a person will affect the choice they make whether or not to help the man or not.
Quotes to reference for comparison 1 and 2. Or we have, in my manner of expression, two minds, the mythic and the philosophical. Tanner says it well. The Platonic perspective thus asks the philosopher to go through the particular to the universal, and beyond the appearance to the essential. Plato directs the philosopher's attention away from the external and the concrete, from taking things at face value, and points deeper and inward, so that one may awaken to a more profound level of reality. But when seen against the mythical backdrop from which I emerged, Thucydides' act of looking beyond the appearances was revolutionary. In contrast to the mythic mind that preceded it, which uncritically follows one story after another, we see Socrates objecting to Minos' giving now that this definition of virtue, now that depending on the circumstance, gender, and status of the person.
Myth, changing and moody. Philosophy, predictable and not content, and desires a structure. Inside a myth, you don't know what's going to happen, but when you're outside the myth, or inside the philosophical mind, you can see what is going to happen. The mythic mind is passive, while the philosophic mind is interactive. You must question what is going to happen, and you can't do that if you don't reflect upon the path you are choosing to follow. Apart from the one Ford mentions in the book about weather and navigating a boat, there are many other examples of this unpredictability of God's wrath to the predictability of nature. This can be true for any kind of natural disaster. You could say an earthquake, hurricane, or tornado would come about because God became angry with humans, or you could predict this weather phenomenon by studying patterns from past experiences of these disasters. Reliant on the senses versus non-sensual and abstract. As mentioned on the other slides, the mythic worldview is reliant on the senses because of their inability to use their mind to explain their actions. Everything you need to know is right in front of you and handed to you. In contrast, the philosophical mind, which develops abstract forms and ideas that cannot be seen in the real world. The forms or categories explain the relationships between dissimilar items or ideas. In other words, we can make decisions about something based just upon our own sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing, but it is better to use our minds to make a decision. You shouldn't make a decision based only upon a sense, say hearing something. For example, if you hear something bad about yourself, you shouldn't jump to conclusions. You should reflect upon what they said and if they really meant it. An example that is used by Ford to compare these contrasting traits is about how a poet represents the mythic worldview and a philosopher represents a philosophical worldview.
Quote references for comparisons 3 and 4. In contrast, the philosophical mind wants a stable order or structure that enables those who perceive it to act consistently and predictably. Knowing the principles of force and weather, we can actively and repeatedly maneuver our boat to port. Knowing what justice demands challenges our self-interest and provides an abstract standard against which to judge the actions of ourselves and others, including the gods. Politically, this is the rule of law in contrast to the capricious, willful men or gods. Furthermore, the philosophical mind is not content with the capriciousness, moody, and lack of predictability inhibited by the mythic mind. The philosophical mind, in contrast, presents us with non-sensual concepts that can be grasped and only by intellect. A philosophical mind will speak in abstraction about happiness and the happy life, whereas the poet will speak concretely by showing the happiness of someone who is newly in love, who watches his or her child succeed in riding a bicycle for the first time, or who achieves a goal for the year. Within the storyline versus abstract.
The mythic worldview follows a storyline. Every belief or ideal, such as justice, is singular and different for everybody. Under a form, there can be many materialistic objects or ideals. This can happen because each of them embody the form, whether for multiple people or for one. While people within the mythic worldview blindly follow a belief, such as one mentioned here about God, the philosophical worldview even categorizes God under a form. Forms can bring radically different objects, such as the government and God, together under one characteristic. In this case, the characteristic is protection. Both can protect us, so God and the government are connected. Another example of this may be the story about how God protected Noah from the flood. God, in a sense, saw the corruption in the people living on earth and made the judgment to destroy them all. He saw the goodness in Noah, and out of the righteousness or goodness of his heart, decided to give humanity another chance to redeem itself. He protected the people from their own corruption.
Myth, within the character. Philosophy, according to who you are. Every character, in the mythic worldview, is given their own sense of what justice is, whether it is the death penalty or life in jail. In this way, beliefs that are important to characters are put upon the people that live within the specific character. When in the philosophic worldview, we also factor in who we are as people and what we see as important in order to do what we think is right. This means that the knowledge, in this case, of social justice can make us do things that people around us may not believe is right, but is in our eyes for the greater good. Another example of this may be the ideal of fairness. In the philosophic mind, we factor in our age, race, and other characteristics to define what this ideal means. For a child, a punishment for breaking a vase might be to sit in a corner, which they will deem as unfair, but for the parent it could seem fair because they are teaching their child about consequences. One path versus multiple paths. In the mythic worldview, there is one path because a person is living within one story. That person already knows where they are going in life subconsciously. No matter what options appear before the person, their decision is already made. In the philosophical mind, however, there are multiple lives you are able to live. The philosophical mind contemplates the effect of every choice they make and how it will impact their lives. For example, other than the obligations to a job and a family, there are also complications with obligations to your schoolwork and to your social life. If you are living within the mythic worldview, where you are following a story of success and achievement, you would not have these conflicts. You would automatically choose to do your schoolwork over going to a party. However, in the philosophical mind, you have to consider how each of the choices will affect you. If you decide your social life and how popular you are important, you will make the decision to put off your schoolwork or not study for something. If you find your education more important, then you will choose to focus on your schoolwork. There is no way to equal out both and accomplish the max with both of them. You will either have to focus on one or divvy out how much time you spend on each of them.
Quote references for comparisons 5 and 6 and 7. When we speak about idealism, meaning that people are motivated by their idea conception of social justice, for example, we acknowledge that idealism can function mythically. That is to say, what we know can motivate us to transcend our self-interest or unself-conscious engagement with our nation, race, or time to work in a higher good. Whereas the mythic mind knows by identification with the characters and actions of the stories. That is, by submitting to their example, the philosophical mind deliberately disengages from and identifies knowledge. The philosophical mind holds even gods to an abstract standard of justice. The philosophical mind knows that life pulls us in different directions, that obligations to job and family are often in conflict.
Real world versus real and transcending world. The philosophical mind and the mythic mind both focus on what is in front and around them in the present and material world. The philosophical mind takes it a step further and allows the person not only to see what is in the real world, but also in a transcending world outside of their own bodies. Say you make a mistake on a piece of art. You only see it as a mistake and feel as if you have to redo your entire project. This is like being in the mythical worldview and only seeing what's in front of you. The philosophical mind will take what is in the real world into an outside world. The mistake that you make on your project can be used and transformed into something beautiful. The philosophical mind will attempt to create something out of the piece that will allow it to connect to other people. Then these people might attribute a certain form to this piece based on how you use the mistake. A poet can be compared to a mythical individual, while a philosopher can be to a philosophic individual. The philosopher doesn't see happiness in sensual things, like newly found love or childhood success. They find happiness in abstract knowledge. Empathy or sympathy are good examples of feelings inside of the mind common to everybody that can bring us happiness and comfort. If you say a common display of happiness is hugs, then this would not fit into the abstract world philosophy is talking about. Instead, it would be dealing with the senses, touch. The poet uses similes and metaphors to compare emotions and feelings to other things, comparing two objects to each other, which deal with the sense of sight, touch, sound, taste, and smell. When Shakespeare writes, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" he is using his senses about a summer's day to describe the person he is talking about, hot, bright, etc. A famous quote from Plato states, "At the touch of a lover, everyone becomes a poet." By introducing a sense of touch to a person's happiness with another, that person becomes a poet who describes his or her feelings based on that touch. The happiness or love is no longer in the mind.
Quotes for comparison 8. A philosopher will speak in abstractions about happiness and the happy life, whereas the poet will speak concretely by showing the happiness of someone who is newly in love, who watches his or her child succeed in riding a bike for the first time, or who achieves a goal for the year. Questions of the philosophical worldview. Typically, the philosophic mind, not unlike the mythic mind, addresses questions of purpose, why, identity, Who am I? What is virtue? Or direction? What am I doing? Why? What is my purpose in life? Is there another meaning? Why am I alive? What is the meaning of life? What am I basing this on?
Strengths. People desire to know the truth. A person in a philosophical worldview is not satisfied to just go through life as a naive individual. This means that they are doing the best they can to understand meaning in everything they do or learn. Everything is connected through forms, so everything is categorized and in order. Philosophy is two-dimensional in that it has two parts, a question and an answer. Everything is laid out and understood.
Weaknesses. The truth can do more harm than good. Sometimes knowing too much causes people to question their purpose in a way that makes them feel meaningless. Philosophy only wants one answer to a question. It does not want people to be different and multifaceted.
The end of life. Does catching the red dot really matter? A question all humans and cats and some dogs probably have asked. Good day.